Hey guys, tonight we pull back the curtain on a different kind of history, true crime. Not the kind found in dusty monarchies or ancient battlefields, but the kind that festers in the quiet corners of our own backyards. We begin with a subject both heartbreaking and horrifying, the intimate, confusing, and deeply unsettling world of a crime that devoured a town. It was an era of flannel shirts and nascent internet culture, a time of whispered fears about devil worship and heavy metal music, an age when the monster you were told to fear wasn't a stranger in the shadows, but your own neighbor's peculiar son. So before you get comfortable, maybe double-check the locks. This isn't a story for the faint of heart. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you're prepared to question what you think you know about guilt, innocence, and the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of a sleepy American town. And let me know in the comments when and where you're tuning in from. It's always fascinating, and a little comforting, to know we're not facing the dark alone. Now, dim the lights. Forget the soft background hum of a fan. Tonight, you might want the silence, just to hear the creaks of your own house. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story doesn't begin in a Gothic castle or a fog-shrouded London alley. It begins in a place far more common, and perhaps far more sinister for its familiarity. It begins in West Memphis, Arkansas. May 5th, 1993. To understand what happened, you first have to understand the place. West Memphis in the early 90s wasn't a postcard town. It was a tough, blue-collar, working-class city sitting in the shadow of its more famous namesake across the Mississippi River in Tennessee. It was a place of truck stops and low-slung buildings, a community anchored by the Bible Belt, where Sunday morning sermons carried the weight of law and local gossip traveled faster than the evening news. It was a town struggling, like many in the region, with poverty, a burgeoning drug problem, and a sense of being left behind. In places like this, life is hard, and people look for simple answers to complex problems. They look for order in the chaos. And when unimaginable chaos arrives, they look for a monster to blame. On that Wednesday evening, 3 8-year-old boys, the best of friends, did what kids do on a warm spring day. They went out to play. There was Stevie Branch, a bright-eyed boy with a Cub Scout sense of adventure. There was Michael Moore, known for his leadership and his sweet nature. And there was Christopher Bias, a boy who, despite a troubled home life, was described as all boy, full of energy and life. They were last seen together around 6:30 p.m., riding their bikes, disappearing into the fading sunlight near a patch of woods known to locals as the Robin Hood Hills. When they didn't return home for dinner, a familiar flicker of parental panic began. At first, it was the usual calls. Is Stevie at your house? Have you seen Michael? But as the hours stretched into a starless night, that flicker grew into a blaze. The parents called the police, but the initial response was tragically, and fatefully, complacent. This was a small town. Kids wander off. They'll turn up by morning, they were told. No formal search was organized that night. The parents, frantic and terrified, were left to search on their own, their calls echoing through the dark, empty streets. The next morning, the sun rose on a town holding its breath. The boys were still missing. A search party was finally, officially, assembled. Volunteers, police officers, and anxious family members fanned out, combing through the local neighborhoods. But many were drawn to the Robin Hood Hills, a tangled, swampy patch of wilderness wedged between a highway and a residential area. It was a place where kids built forts and told ghost stories, a liminal space between the mundane world of suburbia and the untamed wild. Around 1:45 p.m. on May 6th, the search came to a horrifying end. A juvenile probation officer, Steve Jones, peering into a muddy drainage ditch, spotted a child's black shoe floating on the murky water. A moment later, he saw it. The pale, naked body of a young boy, partially submerged. Soon, the other two were found nearby. The 3 friends, Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Bias, were dead. The discovery sent a shockwave of grief and terror through West Memphis. This wasn't just a tragedy, it was a violation. Something unspeakable had happened in their town, in a place their children played. The scene itself was a tableau of absolute horror. The boys were naked, their clothes found nearby, some tied into knots. They had been bound with their own shoelaces, left ankle to left wrist, right ankle to right wrist, in a manner that suggested a terrifying, methodical cruelty. The official term is hog tying. The cause of death was determined to be multiple injuries and drowning. But it was the nature of the injuries that began to fuel the town's darkest fears. Christopher Bias, in particular, had suffered horrific mutilation. The coroner's report would later detail severe trauma to his head and body, and most disturbingly, the removal of his genitals. It was this detail, grotesque and seemingly ritualistic, that lit the fuse of a powder keg. This wasn't just murder, people whispered. This was something else. This was evil. The crime scene itself was, by modern standards, a catastrophe of mismanagement. In the initial chaos and horror, dozens of people, police, volunteers, family members, trampled through the area. Evidence was compromised, destroyed, or simply overlooked. The water in the ditch where the boys were found was not properly drained and searched for trace evidence until much later. This initial failure to secure and process the scene properly would haunt the case for decades, leaving a vacuum of hard evidence that would soon be filled with something far more volatile. Suspicion, rumor, and a community's desperate need for a devil. In the absence of facts, fear began to write its own story. And in 1993 West Memphis, that story was about to find its villains. To understand the investigation that followed, you can't just look at the facts of the crime. You have to understand the cultural atmosphere of the time. The late 1980s and early 1990s were the height of a phenomenon that now seems like a bizarre fever dream. The Satanic Panic. It was a widespread moral panic, fueled by daytime talk shows, sensationalist books, and questionable experts, that convinced millions of Americans that a vast, underground network of Satan-worshipping cults was operating in their communities. These cults, the story went, were responsible for a litany of horrors: ritual abuse, animal sacrifice, and, most terrifyingly, the abduction and murder of children. There was virtually no credible evidence to support these nationwide claims, but that didn't matter. The narrative was too powerful, too seductive in its ability to explain random acts of evil. In a world that felt increasingly chaotic, the idea of an organized, malevolent force provided a twisted kind of comfort. It was easier to believe in a devil you could fight than in the terrifying randomness of human cruelty. This panic had a very specific checklist of warning signs: listening to heavy metal music like Metallica or Slayer, reading books about witchcraft or the occult, wearing black clothing, and being a social outcast. These weren't just teenage quirks. They were signs of demonic influence. When the bodies of the 3 boys were discovered, hogtied and mutilated, in the woods of a deeply religious southern town, it was as if the script for the Satanic Panic had been written for this very moment. The police, led by Inspector Gary Gitchell of the West Memphis Police Department, were under immense pressure to find the killer. The entire community was terrified and demanding answers. And very quickly, the investigation began to pivot away from traditional police work and toward a narrative of occult ritual. A juvenile officer named Jerry Driver, who had been involved in the initial search, mentioned to investigators that he had a file on a local teenager who might be involved in a cult. This teenager, he said, had a history of troubling behavior and an interest in the occult. His name was Damien Eccles. And with that, the spotlight found its first target. Damien Eccles, 18, was the town's resident goth, its weirdo, its outcast. In a community of crew cuts and football jerseys, Eccles stood out. He was pale and slight, with long black hair. He wore black trench coats even in the Arkansas heat. He listened to Metallica, read Stephen King and Anne Rice, and dabbled in Wicca, a nature-based religion that had absolutely nothing to do with Satanism, a distinction lost on almost everyone in West Memphis. He was intelligent, cynical, and openly contemptuous of the town's conformist culture. To the authorities, he wasn't just a teenager going through a phase. He was the living embodiment of every warning sign the Satanic Panic had ever preached. He was, in their eyes, the perfect suspect. Soon, the circle of suspicion widened to include Eccles's closest friend, Jason Baldwin. Baldwin, 16, was quieter and more reserved than Eccles. He was shy, artistic, and shared his friend's taste in music and clothing. He was seen as impressionable, the loyal follower to Eccles's charismatic leader. Together, they were a two-man tribe of outsiders, their friendship a refuge from a world that didn't understand them. Their nonconformity, which in another time or place might have been ignored, was now seen as evidence of a sinister pact. The police had their ringleader and his lieutenant. But they needed more. Their theory required a group, a coven. And that's when they found their third, and most vulnerable, piece of the puzzle. Jesse Miskelly Jr. Jesse, 17, was on the periphery of Eccles and Baldwin's social circle. He was not their close friend, but he knew them. Unlike the other two, Jesse was not an intellectual or an artist. He was a high school dropout with a documented IQ of just 72, bordering on intellectual disability. He was known for being easily led, eager to please, and prone to telling tall tales to get attention. He was a follower, a kid who desperately wanted to fit in but never quite could. He was, for a police force desperate for a confession, the perfect weak link. The police had no physical evidence linking any of these three teenagers to the crime scene. No blood, no hair, no fingerprints. Nothing. All they had was a theory, born of a national hysteria, and the profile of a troubled local teen. But in the charged atmosphere of West Memphis in 1993, that was more than enough. The hunt was no longer for a killer. It was for confirmation of a pre-existing belief. The stage was set for an interrogation that would seal the fates of three young men and become one of the most infamous and tragic examples of coerced confession in American legal history. The monster had a face, and his name was Damien Eccles. Now, all they needed was for someone to say they saw him commit the crime. On June 3, 1993, nearly a month after the murders, the police brought Jesse Miskelly Jr. in for questioning. What followed was not an interview. It was a psychological dismantling. For approximately 12 hours, with only a few short breaks, Jesse Miskelly, a 17-year-old with the intellectual capacity of a young child, was interrogated by multiple officers, including Inspector Gitchell and detectives from the Crittenden County Sheriff's Department. He was not accompanied by a parent. He was not provided with a lawyer. His Miranda rights were read to him, but it's highly debatable whether he truly understood what they meant. The tapes of the interrogation, of which only 46 minutes were recorded, are a chilling document of police coercion. The detectives used a classic and devastatingly effective interrogation technique. They were friendly, fatherly even. They told Jesse they were his friends, that they were there to help him, that they already knew everything that had happened. They just needed him to tell the truth, and if he did, he could go home. They fed him details of the crime, details that only the police or the real killer would know, and then praised him when he repeated those details back to them. "We know what happened, Jesse," they would say. "We've talked to other people. We know you were there. We just need you to tell us about it." Miskelly's responses were confused, contradictory, and filled with guesses. He got the time of the murders wrong, initially claiming they happened in the morning when the boys were at school. The police corrected him. He got the location of the attacks wrong. The police corrected him. He described the victims being tied up with rope. The police corrected him, telling him they were tied with shoelaces. He was, in essence, being given a script, and his only job was to read it. He repeatedly denied his involvement, saying "I don't know" and "I wasn't there" over and over again. But the pressure was relentless. The detectives suggested that Damien and Jason were the real culprits and that Jesse was just a witness. They implied that if he cooperated, he would be treated leniently, perhaps even given a reward. The allure of being seen as helpful, combined with his intellectual limitations and sheer exhaustion, began to wear him down. Finally, after hours of this psychological barrage, Jesse broke. He began to weave a story, a patchwork of the details fed to him by the police and his own desperate attempts to please them. He claimed that he had witnessed Damien Eccles and Jason Baldwin murder the three boys in a satanic ritual. He described a scene of madness in the Robin Hood Hills, a narrative that perfectly matched the police's occult theory. He implicated his two acquaintances in a crime of unimaginable brutality. The confession was a mess of inconsistencies. He couldn't remember basic facts that an actual witness would never forget. He was vague and uncertain. But it didn't matter. The police had what they needed. They had a confession, signed and delivered, that pointed the finger directly at their primary suspects. That evening, Damien Eccles and Jason Baldwin were arrested. The town of West Memphis breathed a collective sigh of relief. The monsters had been caught. The defense would later argue that the confession was entirely fabricated, the product of illegal coercion and a vulnerable suspect's inability to withstand pressure. Experts would testify that individuals with low IQs are particularly susceptible to this kind of manipulation, often confessing to crimes they didn't commit simply to end the stress of the interrogation. But in the court of public opinion, and soon in a court of law, Jesse Miskelly's words were treated as gospel. His confession became the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, a foundation built not on evidence, but on the desperate, confused words of a child in a small, dark room. It was a story the town wanted to hear, and the police had made sure someone told it. With Jesse Miskelly's confession in hand, the prosecution, led by District Attorney John Fogelman, had its narrative. Now they just needed to build a case around it. This proved to be a significant challenge, because beyond the coerced statement, they had almost nothing. The complete absence of physical evidence linking Eccles, Baldwin, or Miskelly to the crime scene was a gaping hole in their case. No DNA, no hair, no fibers, no fingerprints on the victim's clothing. The murder weapon, or weapons, were never found. In a typical murder trial, this lack of forensic evidence would be a fatal blow to the prosecution. But this was not a typical trial. This was a trial about a story of good versus evil, of a Christian community under attack by satanic forces. And in a story like that, character and symbolism can be more powerful than evidence. So, the prosecution set about building a case based on character assassination and cultural prejudice. Damien Eccles' life became an open book for the prosecution to misread and misrepresent. His interest in the occult and Wicca was twisted into proof of Satanism. His personal journals, filled with the dark, angsty poetry typical of a troubled teenager, were presented as blueprints for murder. The books he checked out from the library, about the Salem witch trials, magic, and mythology, were treated as a devil worshipper's training manual. His black clothing wasn't a fashion choice. It was a uniform. His listening to Metallica wasn't a pastime. It was an act of summoning dark energies. Every aspect of his nonconformity was pathologized and presented to the jury as evidence of a depraved and homicidal mind. The prosecution brought in a supposed occult expert named Dr. Dale Griffiths. Griffiths, a retired police officer with a mail-order PhD, testified that the murders bore all the hallmarks of a satanic ritual. He claimed the date, near a pagan holiday, was significant. He claimed the water at the scene was symbolic. He connected Eccles' drawings and interests directly to the crime, painting him as the high priest of a teenage death cult. This testimony, while scientifically baseless and later widely discredited, was incredibly effective in the courtroom. It gave the jury a framework, a seemingly expert-approved lens through which to view all the other circumstantial evidence. To bolster their case, the prosecution also relied on a series of highly questionable witnesses. One was a young woman named Vicky Hutchison. She initially came to the police with a story, but later admitted that she had been pressured by them. The police allegedly threatened to take her child away and offered her a reward if she could get a confession from Eccles or Baldwin. She allowed the police to place a hidden microphone in her home, but the boys said nothing incriminating. Later, on the stand, she would deliver a shaky, inconsistent testimony, claiming she had attended a satanic meeting where the boys discussed the murders. Her story was full of holes and would eventually be recanted. Then there was the jailhouse informant. A man named Michael Carson, who shared a cell with Eccles, claimed that Eccles had confessed the murders to him in graphic detail. Jailhouse snitches are notoriously unreliable, often motivated by deals for reduced sentences or other favors. Carson's testimony was no different, and he too would later recant, admitting he had fabricated the entire story. Perhaps the most absurd piece of evidence was a knife. A serrated survival knife belonging to Jason Baldwin's family was found by a local man in a lake near the Baldwin home. The prosecution presented this as a potential murder weapon. However, The forensic expert testified that the wounds on the victims were not consistent with this type of knife. Furthermore, the knife was found to be clean of any blood. It was a dead end, but it was presented to the jury with dramatic flair, another prop in the prosecution's story. The defense teams for the three boys were underfunded and outmatched. They tried to poke holes in the prosecution's narrative, pointing to the lack of physical evidence and the unreliability of the witnesses. They tried to explain the difference between Wicca and Satanism. They tried to show that the boys were just kids, outsiders who were being scapegoated because they were different. But they were fighting against a tidal wave of fear and prejudice. Every piece of circumstantial evidence, no matter how flimsy, was seen through the lens of the satanic cult theory. The prosecution didn't have a case built on evidence. They had a case built on a moral panic. And in the emotionally charged environment of that courtroom, it was all they would need. In early 1994, the trials began. The state decided to try Jesse Misskelley Jr. separately from Damien Echols and Jason Baldwin. This was a strategic move by the prosecution. Misskelley's confession was the only thing directly implicating Echols and Baldwin, but under legal rules, it couldn't be used against them in a joint trial because Misskelley would not be testifying. By trying him first, the prosecution hoped to secure a conviction, create momentum, and validate the confession in the public eye. Misskelley's trial was a tragic formality. His defense attorneys argued passionately that his confession was coerced and should be thrown out. They presented evidence of his low IQ and his suggestibility. They played the tapes of the interrogation, hoping the jury would see the obvious manipulation. But the prosecution, led by John Fogelman, painted a picture of a young man who had unburdened his soul. They argued that the details in the confession were so specific that only someone who was there could have known them, conveniently ignoring the fact that the police had fed him most of those details. The jury, composed of citizens from the same community steeped in fear and rumor, sided with the prosecution. On February 5, 1994, Jesse Misskelley Jr. was found guilty of 1 count of first-degree murder and 2 counts of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison plus 40 years. He was 18 years old. A few weeks later, the main event began. The joint trial of Damien Echols and Jason Baldwin. The atmosphere in the courtroom was electric, a mix of a media circus and a modern-day witch hunt. The prosecution rolled out its full narrative, presenting Echols as the malevolent, satanic ringleader and Baldwin as his loyal, corrupted disciple. Dr. Dale Griffiths, the occult expert, was back on the stand, explaining the symbolic significance of everything from the phases of the moon to the color black. Witnesses like Vicky Hutchison and the jailhouse informant delivered their coached and later recanted testimonies. The prosecution paraded Damien's black clothes, his books, and his journals before the jury. The trial was also marked by the bizarre and erratic behavior of John Mark Bias, the stepfather of victim Christopher Bias. Bias was a flamboyant and emotional figure. He frequently appeared in court wearing overalls, carrying a Bible, and giving tearful, rambling interviews to the news cameras outside. He was openly hostile towards the defendants, at one point screaming at them in the hallway. Yet, his behavior also raised suspicions. In a strange and now infamous moment, he gave a knife from his own collection to one of the documentary filmmakers who were covering the trial. When the filmmakers had the knife tested, it was found to have traces of blood on it that were consistent with both his own and his stepson Christopher's blood types. While this was never conclusively proven to be related to the murder, his behavior added another layer of chaos and confusion to the proceedings, a spectacle that often distracted from the glaring weaknesses in the prosecution's case against Echols and Baldwin. The defense did its best to counter the storm of innuendo. They pointed out that there was no physical evidence whatsoever. They brought in their own experts who testified that the satanic elements were pure fantasy. They tried to present Damien and Jason as they were. Confused, scared teenagers caught in a nightmare. But it was like trying to argue logic in a hurricane of emotion. The prosecution's story was simple, terrifying, and satisfying. The defense's story was complex, nuanced, and required the jury to question the very authorities and beliefs that structured their community. On March 18, 1994, the jury delivered its verdict. Jason Baldwin was found guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Damien Echols, painted as the mastermind, received the ultimate punishment. He was also found guilty on all counts and was sentenced to death by lethal injection. As the verdicts were read, the courtroom erupted. The victims' families wept with relief, believing justice had been served. Damien Eccles, pale and stoic, was led away to death row. Jason Baldwin, just a boy, sobbed uncontrollably. The trial was over. The monsters had been condemned. The town of West Memphis could finally sleep again. But for many, a gnawing question remained. In their rush to slay a demon, had they just created one? The case was closed, but the story was far from over. A new chapter, one of activism, doubt, and a search for a different kind of truth, was about to begin. After the convictions, the story of the West Memphis Three, as they came to be known, largely faded from the national consciousness. For the state of Arkansas, the case was closed. For the families of the victims, a painful chapter had ended, though their grief remained. But for Damien Eccles, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Miskelly Jr., the nightmare had just entered a new, grinding phase of incarceration and appeals. Damien Eccles was sent to Arkansas's death row, a brutal and isolating world where he would spend the next 18 years in a tiny cell, 23 hours a day, awaiting his execution. Jason Baldwin and Jesse Miskelly began serving their life sentences, their youth evaporating behind prison walls. For several years, their legal appeals went nowhere, shot down by the same local courts that had convicted them. The case seemed destined to become another tragic footnote in the history of American justice. But then, something happened that no one could have predicted. In 1996, HBO premiered a documentary by filmmakers Joe Berlinger and Bruce Sinofsky titled Paradise Lost: The Child Murders at Robin Hood Hills. Paradise Lost was a watershed moment. For the first time, a national audience saw the case not through the lens of the prosecution, but through the raw, unfiltered footage of the trials, the community, and the defendants themselves. The documentary laid bare the flimsy evidence, the questionable witnesses, the overt prejudice, and the manipulative interrogation of Jesse Miskelly. It showed Damien Eccles not as a monster, but as an articulate, if troubled, young man. It captured the bizarre, attention-seeking behavior of John Mark Bias. It didn't offer a definitive answer as to who committed the murders, but it raised profound and disturbing questions about whether the right people were in prison. The film became a sensation, particularly among a new generation coming of age with the internet. Websites and online forums dedicated to the case began to spring up. A grassroots movement was born, made up of ordinary people from around the world who believed a terrible injustice had occurred. They called themselves the Free the West Memphis Three movement. They dissected trial transcripts, shared information, and raised money for a new legal defense fund. The internet, in its infancy, became a powerful tool for citizen activism, allowing a small-town secret to become a global cause. The movement gained significant momentum when it attracted the support of various artists and celebrities who had seen the documentary and were outraged. Figures like Pearl Jam's Eddie Vedder, The Clash's Joe Strummer, actor Johnny Depp, and musician Henry Rollins became vocal advocates. They held benefit concerts, released fundraising albums, and used their platforms to shine a bright, public light on the case. Their involvement brought not only awareness but also crucial funding, allowing the defense team to hire top-tier forensic experts and investigators who could re-examine the case with a level of scientific rigor that was absent in the original investigation. While this movement grew on the outside, a significant development was happening on the inside. On death row, Damien Eccles, who had entered prison as an angry teenager, began a profound journey of self-education, immersing himself in literature, philosophy, and Zen Buddhism as a means of survival. He also began a correspondence with Laurie Davis, a landscape architect from New York who had seen Paradise Lost and felt compelled to reach out. Their letters blossomed into a deep connection, and in 1999, they were married in a ceremony on death row. Laurie became a tireless and instrumental force in the fight for his freedom, working alongside the legal team and activists. The Paradise Lost sequel in 2000, Revelations, further fueled the movement by highlighting new evidence and recanted testimonies. The story of the West Memphis Three was no longer just a legal case. It was a cultural phenomenon, a symbol of a justice system gone awry. The pressure on the state of Arkansas was building. The tide of public opinion had turned, and the demand for a fresh look at the case became impossible to ignore. A new phase of the fight was beginning, one that would move from the court of public opinion back into the courtroom, armed with something that had been missing all along: science. The momentum created by the Paradise Lost documentaries and the global support movement provided the West Memphis Three's new, high-powered defense team with the resources to do what the original lawyers could not: conduct a thorough, scientific reinvestigation of the case. The legal strategy shifted from simply arguing procedural errors to actively seeking the truth of what happened on May 5, 1993, using modern forensic technology. The single most significant development was the advent of advanced DNA testing, which was not widely available at the time of the original trials. The defense team filed motions to have the surviving evidence from the crime scene tested for DNA. For years, the state resisted. But after a long legal battle, in 2007, a judge finally ordered the testing to proceed. The results were explosive. Of all the DNA evidence recovered from the crime scene, from the victim's clothing, the ligatures used to bind them, and other items, none of it matched Damian Eccles, Jason Baldwin, or Jesse Miskelly Jr. Not a single trace of them was found. This was a stunning confirmation of what the defense had argued all along. There was no physical evidence placing them at the scene of the crime. But the DNA tests revealed something more. A single human hair, found in one of the knots of the shoelace ligature used to bind Michael Moore, was tested. It did not match any of the victims or the 3 convicted men. Instead, it was found to be a genetic match to Terry Hobbs, the stepfather of victim Stevie Branch. Furthermore, another hair, found on a tree stump near the bodies, was consistent with the DNA of one of Hobbs's friends, David Jacobe, with whom Hobbs had been on the day the boys disappeared. Suddenly, a new and compelling alternative suspect emerged. Terry Hobbs had an alibi for the time of the murders, but his history was troubling. There were later allegations from his own family of a violent temper and a history of abuse. He had been one of the last people to see Stevie Branch alive. The defense argued that Hobbs, not 3 teenagers in a satanic cult, was a far more plausible suspect. Hobbs has always vehemently denied any involvement in the murders, and he has never been charged. But the DNA evidence created a powerful new narrative that directly contradicted the state's entire case. As the DNA evidence shifted focus to Terry Hobbs, another original person of interest came back under scrutiny: John Mark Bias, Christopher Bias's stepfather. His bizarre behavior during the trial had always raised red flags. After the convictions, his wife, Christopher's mother, died under mysterious circumstances, ruled undetermined. Bias had a criminal record, and his stories about his whereabouts on the day of the murders were inconsistent. The knife he gave to the Paradise Lost filmmakers, which tested positive for blood consistent with his and his stepson's DNA, was a tantalizing but ultimately inconclusive lead. Bias also denied any involvement, and he later passed a polygraph test regarding the murders. While suspicion lingered, the case against him was purely circumstantial, unlike the DNA link to Hobbs. In addition to the new forensic evidence, the original trial itself began to crumble under review. It was revealed that one of the jurors in the Eccles-Baldwin trial, the jury foreman, had discussed the case with his son, who was an attorney, during the trial, a clear case of jury misconduct. He had also failed to disclose that he had a prior conviction. These revelations further undermined the integrity of the original verdicts. The foundation of the state's case, already built on the sand of moral panic and a coerced confession, was now being washed away by a wave of scientific evidence and legal scrutiny. In 2010, the Arkansas Supreme Court finally acknowledged the weight of the new evidence and ordered that Damian Eccles be granted a new evidentiary hearing, a chance to present all the new findings in court. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, there was a genuine possibility that the West Memphis Three could be exonerated and walk free. The question was, would the state of Arkansas ever be willing to admit it had been wrong? The 2010 ruling by the Arkansas Supreme Court was a monumental victory for the defense. It meant that all the new evidence, the DNA results, the jury misconduct, the recanted testimonies, could finally be presented in a courtroom. A new evidentiary hearing was scheduled for December 2011. The defense team was optimistic, believing they had an overwhelming case for not just a new trial, but for complete exoneration. However, the state of Arkansas found itself in an impossible position. To proceed with a new trial would be a massive, high-profile gamble. Their original case was in tatters. Their star witnesses had recanted, their occult expert was discredited, and the new DNA evidence pointed away from the convicted men and toward another suspect. A new trial would likely result in an acquittal, which would not only be a major public embarrassment but could also open the state up to a massive lawsuit for wrongful conviction, potentially costing taxpayers millions of dollars. The prospect of having to admit they had sent an innocent man to death row and kept 2 others in prison for 18 years was a political and legal nightmare. On the other hand, the defense team also faced a risk. While they were confident in their case, a trial is always unpredictable. A new jury could, for some reason, still convict. For Damien Echols, who was still on death row, losing a new trial would mean his execution would move forward. For Jason Baldwin and Jesse Miskelly, it would mean spending the rest of their lives in prison. There was no guarantee of victory. Faced with this complex and high-stakes dilemma, the two sides began to negotiate a way out. The solution they arrived at was a rare and legally complex maneuver known as an Alford plea. An Alford plea is a strange legal creature. It allows a defendant to maintain their innocence while formally pleading guilty. Essentially, the defendant says, "I did not commit this crime, but I acknowledge that the prosecution has enough evidence to likely convince a jury to convict me, so I will accept the sentence as if I were guilty." It's a pragmatic compromise. For the defendant, it offers a way to avoid the risk of a harsher sentence from a trial. For the state, it allows them to close the case, avoid the cost and risk of a trial, and maintain the original conviction on the books, thereby protecting themselves from lawsuits. The defense team was divided on the plea. Jason Baldwin, in particular, was vehemently against it. He had maintained his innocence for 18 years and wanted to clear his name completely. The idea of pleading guilty, even in this technical sense, was abhorrent to him. However, Damien Echols' life was on the line. The plea deal was the only guaranteed way to get him off death row immediately. After an emotional and difficult debate, Baldwin was persuaded to accept the deal for the sake of his friend. On August 19, 2011, Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Miskelly Jr., now men in their mid-30s, were brought back into a Jonesboro, Arkansas, courtroom. In a surreal hearing, they stood before the judge and entered their Alford pleas. They formally pleaded guilty to the murders while simultaneously asserting their innocence. The judge accepted the pleas, resentenced them to the 18 years they had already served, and then, just like that, they were ordered to be released. They walked out of the courthouse as free men, blinking in the sunlight of a world that had changed immeasurably since they were last in it. They were greeted by a crowd of supporters, family, and media. There were tears, hugs, and a profound sense of disbelief. They were free, but they were not exonerated. They were out of prison, but in the eyes of the law, they were still the convicted killers of 3 8-year-old boys. It was a victory, but a bitter and incomplete one. A story that began with a terrible crime had ended not with a resolution, but with a compromise, leaving the deepest questions still unanswered. Today, the men known as the West Memphis Three live with the strange and heavy paradox of their freedom. They are out in the world, but the shadows of the Robin Hood Hills have never truly left them. Damien Echols, who spent half his life on death row, has become an author, an artist, and a public speaker. He and his wife Lori Davis moved to New York City and have built a life far from the Arkansas that tried to execute him. He has written moving memoirs about his ordeal, detailing his survival through a disciplined practice of magic and meditation. He continues to fight, not just for his own complete exoneration, but for the abolition of the death penalty, using his experience as a powerful testament to the fallibility of the justice system. Jason Baldwin, the loyal friend who was so reluctant to accept the Alford plea, has dedicated his life to preventing what happened to him from happening to others. After his release, he moved to Seattle, fell in love, and got married. He has since co-founded Proclaim Justice, a non-profit organization that works to support and exonerate wrongfully convicted individuals. He fights for others with the same unwavering conviction he held for himself during his 18 years in prison. Jesse Miskelly Jr., the most vulnerable of the three, has had the most difficult time adjusting to life outside. His intellectual disabilities and the trauma of his experience have made reintegration a constant struggle. He has had a few minor run-ins with the law and has largely tried to stay out of the public eye, a quiet and tragic figure still bearing the scars of that 12-hour interrogation. And what of the crime that started it all? The murders of Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Bias remain, officially, unsolved. Because of the Alford plea, the state of Arkansas considers the case closed. The three boys, whose brutal deaths tore a community apart and set in motion a decades-long legal saga, have never received true justice. Their killer, or killers, have never been held accountable. The story of the West Memphis Three is more than just a true crime narrative. It's a chilling case study in the dangers of mass hysteria, a cautionary tale about how fear can poison a community and pervert a justice system. It's a story about how a society, in its desperate search for a monster, can be persuaded to create one out of its own anxieties, targeting those who are different, those on the margins. It reveals the terrifying fallibility of our legal institutions, where coerced confessions can be mistaken for truth and prejudice can be dressed up as evidence. But it is also, in its own way, a story of resilience and the power of truth. It shows how the tireless work of documentary filmmakers, activists, and ordinary citizens can shine a light into the darkest corners and force a system to confront its own failures. It is a testament to the human spirit's ability to endure the unimaginable, to find purpose in suffering, and to continue fighting for justice even after the world has declared the case closed. The woods of Robin Hood Hills are quiet now. The anger and fear that once consumed West Memphis have subsided into a dull, lingering ache. But the ghosts of 1993 remain. The ghosts of three little boys who went out to play and never came home, and the ghosts of three teenagers who were sacrificed to a town's fear. The case may be over, but the story ends where it began, with a profound and unsettling question that still hangs over the state of Arkansas. A question that whispers from the muddy water of that drainage ditch. Who really killed the children of West Memphis? And now, we leave the humid swamps of the Bible Belt and travel west, where our next story unfolds under the vast, bleached blue sky of New Mexico. Here, the fears are different. The darkness doesn't come from a community's panic, but from the charismatic smile of a single man. This is not a story of satanic cults, but of reptilian aliens and pseudoscientific conspiracies, where the line between love and delusion dissolves into blood. In the American Southwest, the desert is a place that has long attracted seekers, dreamers, and those looking to reinvent themselves. But sometimes, what gets reinvented is not a life, but a lie. And sometimes, beneath the brilliant sun, the darkest kinds of shadows grow. Our story begins here, in Albuquerque, in the final year of the 20th century, with a woman whose bright smile masked a world of fear, and a man whose charm was a carefully constructed cage. Girlie Chu Hossenkopf was a name that, like her personality, was vibrant and memorable. Born in Malaysia, she was a woman of intelligence, warmth, and a quiet determination. She had come to America seeking the promise it held for so many. A new life, opportunity, and perhaps, love. She worked as a bank teller, known to her customers and colleagues for her professionalism and her unfailing kindness. She was poised, elegant, and possessed a spirit that seemed both gentle and resilient. In 1993, she married a man who seemed to be the embodiment of the American dream. A man with a dazzling resume and an even more dazzling smile. His name was Diazian Hossenkopf. To the outside world, Diazian and Girlie were a picture of success. He presented himself as a brilliant thoracic surgeon and cancer researcher, a man of genius intellect on the cusp of revolutionary medical breakthroughs. He was handsome, charismatic, and exuded an aura of confidence and authority that was almost hypnotic. He claimed to have multiple doctorates, to be working on a cure for cancer, and to be engaged in top-secret genetic research that would change the world. They lived in a comfortable home in Albuquerque, and to anyone looking in, theirs was a life of ambition and prosperity. But inside that home, the picture was very different. The man Girlie had married was not a healer. He was a tormentor. Diazian Hossenkopf was a master of control, a man whose charm was a weapon he used to isolate and dominate his wife. The marriage was, by all accounts, a toxic and abusive one. Gurley was living in a state of constant fear, subjected to psychological and emotional cruelty. By 1999, she had finally gathered the courage to leave him. She filed for divorce, a brave act of self-preservation that would, tragically, seal her fate. She was trying to escape a cage, but the man who built it was not about to let her fly free. On the morning of September 10, 1999, Gurley Chu was scheduled to report to her job at the bank. She never arrived. Her colleagues, knowing her to be exceptionally reliable, were immediately concerned. When she didn't answer her phone, they called the police. Officers were dispatched to her apartment for a welfare check. They found no sign of Gurley. Her car was missing. At first, it seemed like a standard missing person case. Perhaps a woman who had simply decided to get away for a day. But those who knew Gurley knew that wasn't her character. And those who knew of her volatile divorce from Diazian Hosenkoft felt a cold dread creeping in. The next day, Gurley's car was found abandoned in a residential area. There was no sign of a struggle, nothing immediately out of the ordinary. But the discovery confirmed the police's growing suspicion. This was not a woman who had left willingly. An investigation was launched, and the first person of interest was, as is so often the case, the estranged husband. When investigators began to look into Diazian Hosenkoft, they expected to find a disgruntled spouse. What they found instead was a rabbit hole of lies so deep and so bizarre it defied belief. The man they were investigating was not just a potential killer. He was a phantom, a carefully constructed illusion, and the truth of who he was, and what he believed, was more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. The search for Gurley Chu had begun, but it would quickly become a search for the very nature of the man who had erased her. The first rule of a con artist is to create a believable fiction. The second is to inhabit it so completely that it becomes, for all intents and purposes, your reality. Diazian Hosenkoft was not just a con artist. He was a virtuoso of the lie, a man who had spent his entire adult life building a fortress of falsehoods around a hollow core. As investigators began to dig into the background of the brilliant thoracic surgeon, the entire edifice came crashing down. He was not a doctor. He had never been to medical school. His claims of multiple PhDs from prestigious universities were pure fantasy. The groundbreaking cancer research he boasted of was non-existent. The man who called himself Diazian Hosenkoft was born with the much more common name of Armand Chavez. He was a high school dropout from Texas with a long and storied history as a grifter and a fraud. He had scammed investors, lied to employers, and charmed his way through life, leaving a trail of duped believers and financial ruin in his wake. His entire identity was a meticulously crafted lie, designed to grant him the status, wealth, and power he so desperately craved. His marriage to Gurley had been part of this grand deception. He needed a poised, intelligent wife to play the part of a doctor's spouse, to lend credibility to his charade. But as his lies became more grandiose, his paranoia and need for control intensified. This is where the story takes a turn from the realm of common fraud into the truly bizarre. Diazian wasn't just pretending to be a doctor. He had constructed an entire worldview, a personal mythology that was a toxic brew of pseudoscience, New Age mysticism, and UFO conspiracy theories. He told people he was not just a researcher, but a geneticist on a secret government payroll, working to create a super race of humans. He claimed to be over 200 years old, kept alive by a special elixir he had developed. He was obsessed with the idea of achieving immortality. But the cornerstone of his bizarre belief system was a conspiracy theory that has lurked in the fringes of ufology for decades. The idea that the world is secretly controlled by a race of shape-shifting, reptilian aliens. According to this theory, these reptilians from another dimension have infiltrated the highest levels of government and society, and they feed on human fear and suffering. Diazian Hosenkoft took this fringe idea and personalized it. He began to believe, or at least claimed to believe, that his own wife, Gurley, was one of them. She was not just a woman trying to divorce him. She was a reptilian queen, an enemy agent sent to thwart his vital work and destroy him. In his twisted narrative, getting rid of Gurley wasn't just about controlling a difficult spouse. It was an act of cosmic warfare, a necessary strike against a malevolent, inhuman force. This bizarre delusion served a dual purpose. It provided a grandiose justification for his murderous rage, transforming a sordid domestic dispute into an epic battle for the future of humanity. It also became a powerful tool of manipulation. A charismatic narcissist like Diazian needs followers, people who will validate his worldview and, if necessary, do his bidding. To a rational person, his claims were absurd. But to someone vulnerable, someone looking for answers or a sense of purpose, Diazian's confidence could be incredibly compelling. He had the uncanny ability to make the insane sound plausible. And he had found just such a person. A woman who would not only believe his stories of ancient elixirs and alien queens, but who would fall so deeply under his spell that she would be willing to help him make his wife disappear forever. The investigation into a missing person was now an investigation into a cult of two, a shared delusion that was about to turn deadly. In any story of manipulation, there is the manipulator and the manipulated. Diazian Hossenkopf was the former, a predator in a doctor's coat. The latter was a woman named Linda Henning. To understand how a seemingly ordinary person could become entangled in a plot of such bizarre cruelty, one has to understand the power of a charismatic psychopath to find and exploit the vulnerabilities of others. Linda Henning was a fashion designer and businesswoman in Albuquerque. By all accounts, she was intelligent, creative, and professionally successful. But she was also, perhaps, lonely and searching for something more. She met Diazian Hossenkopf and was immediately captivated. He was everything she was looking for. Handsome, intelligent, successful, and exciting. He showered her with attention and drew her into his world, a world that seemed far more thrilling than her own. Quickly, their relationship blossomed into an intense affair. Diazian fed her the same lines he fed everyone else. He was a brilliant scientist, working on a cure for cancer. His wife, Gurley, was a problem. At first, the problems were mundane. She was difficult, unsupportive. But soon, Diazian began to introduce the more fantastical elements of his mythology. He wasn't just a doctor. He was a warrior in a secret cosmic conflict. And Gurley wasn't just a difficult wife. She was an alien, a reptilian in human form, sent to sabotage his life-saving work. It is a testament to Diazian's manipulative genius that Linda Henning did not run. Instead, she believed him. She became a true believer. Diazian's world offered her a starring role in an epic drama. She wasn't just the other woman. She was a vital partner to a genius, a soldier in the fight for humanity's future. Her love for him became intertwined with his delusional ideology. She began to see Gurley not as a person, a woman suffering in an abusive marriage, but as a threat, a monster that needed to be eliminated. The police quickly identified Linda Henning as a key figure in the investigation. Her affair with Diazian was common knowledge among their friends. When investigators searched her home, they found books on how to assume a new identity, books on forensics, and, most disturbingly, Diazian Hossenkopf's personal writings, filled with his bizarre theories about reptilians and his plans for achieving immortality. Linda became a prime suspect, not just an accomplice but a potential co-conspirator. The investigation was now focused on a triangle of obsession and deceit. A husband who wanted his wife gone, a lover who had bought into his madness, and the missing victim. But the police still lacked the crucial piece of the puzzle: physical evidence of a crime. They had a motive and a cast of characters, but no body and no murder weapon. The desert around Albuquerque is vast and unforgiving, a perfect place to hide a secret. The police began to search, but they feared that Gurley Chu, and the truth of what happened to her, might be lost forever to the sand and the silence. Then, a stroke of luck, a discovery in the desert that would blow the case wide open and reveal the gruesome reality behind the alien fantasies. The desert holds its secrets well, but sometimes, it gives them up. On September 19, 1999, 9 days after Gurley Chu's disappearance, a man hiking in a remote area west of Albuquerque, near a place called the West Mesa, stumbled upon a disturbing scene. Half buried in the sand was a green torp, rolled up and taped shut. Curious, he nudged it. It was heavy, and something about it felt deeply wrong. He called the police. When investigators arrived and carefully unrolled the torp, they found what they had been searching for. Not a body, but the bloody aftermath of a horrific act of violence. The torp was stained with a significant amount of human blood. Inside the bundle, they also found a mass of dark hair, duct tape, and other debris. But the most shocking item was a sword, a Japanese-style katana. The sword, along with the torp, was sent for forensic analysis. The blood on the torp was a match for Girly Chew. The investigation had just turned from a missing person case into a homicide. The discovery of the torp and the sword was the physical proof they needed, but the police still needed to connect it to their suspects. That connection came from an unlikely source, a man on the periphery of Diazian's strange world, a man who had been roped into the plot and was now terrified. His name was Bill Miller. Bill Miller was a friend and employee of Diazian Hossenkoft. He was not a true believer like Linda Henning, but he was intimidated by Diazian and perhaps drawn in by his charismatic personality and promises of money. According to what Miller would later tell investigators, Diazian had approached him with a plan. He wanted Girly taken care of, and he needed Miller's help. Faced with the mounting evidence and the intense police scrutiny, Bill Miller cracked. He walked into a police station and told them everything he knew. His confession provided a chilling, step-by-step account of the murder of Girly Chew Hossenkoft. According to Miller, on the morning of September 10th, Diazian and Linda Henning went to Girly's apartment. They subdued her with ether, bound her with duct tape, and forced her into the trunk of her own car. They then drove her to a remote location. Diazian, according to Miller's account, had planned the murder with cold, calculated precision. He had assembled a kill kit, which included the torp, tape, and weapons. Miller's role, he claimed, was to help with the cleanup and disposal. He told police that after the murder, he helped Diazian and Linda clean Girly's apartment, trying to erase any trace of the struggle. He described them using cleaning chemicals and working methodically to remove any blood evidence. Despite their efforts, crime scene investigators were later able to find traces of Girly's blood on the carpet and carpet padding, corroborating Miller's story. Miller's confession was the final nail in the coffin for the prosecution's case against Diazian and Linda. He gave them the narrative, the timeline, and the horrifying details. He implicated Linda Henning as a direct and willing participant in the abduction and murder. He painted Diazian Hossenkoft not as a delusional eccentric, but as a cold-blooded, manipulative killer who had orchestrated every detail of his wife's demise. In October 1999, Diazian Hossenkoft and Linda Henning were arrested and charged with the murder of Girly Chew. The bizarre tale of reptilian queens and secret government research was now grounded in the grim reality of a brutal homicide. The search for a missing woman had ended. Now, the fight for justice would begin. A fight that would be just as strange and unpredictable as the crime itself, culminating in a stunning betrayal in the courtroom. The trials of Diazian Hossenkoft and Linda Henning were destined to be one of the most sensational legal spectacles in New Mexico's history. The case had everything: a beautiful, murdered victim, a charismatic, sociopathic mastermind, a lover accused of being a willing accomplice, and a backdrop of bizarre conspiracy theories involving aliens and immortality. The media descended on Albuquerque, and the courtroom became a theater for a story that seemed torn from the pages of a science fiction novel. Linda Henning's trial began first, in the fall of 2002. Her defense strategy was a risky one. She claimed she was a victim herself, a pawn who had been brainwashed by the powerfully manipulative Diazian. Her lawyers argued that she had been so thoroughly indoctrinated into his delusional worldview that she was incapable of forming criminal intent. They painted a picture of a woman so in love and so psychologically dominated that she lost her own identity and became an extension of his will. It was a classic brainwashing defense, difficult to prove and often viewed skeptically by juries. The prosecution, however, presented a very different picture of Linda Henning. They portrayed her as a cold, jealous, and willing participant, motivated by her obsession with Diazian and her desire to eliminate her rival, Girly. They used her own actions against her: her purchase of books on how to change one's identity, her presence at the scene, and the physical evidence linking her to the crime. The state star witness was Bill Miller, who testified in detail about Henning's active role in the abduction and the cleanup. The jury was faced with two competing narratives. Was Linda Henning a brainwashed victim or a cold-blooded killer? After a long and dramatic trial, they sided with the prosecution. In October 2002, Linda Henning was found guilty of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy. She was sentenced to 73 years in prison. While Linda Henning's fate was being decided, Diazian Hossenkopf was playing a very different game. His trial was set to follow Henning's. He was facing the death penalty, and the evidence against him was overwhelming, especially with Bill Miller's testimony. Seeing the writing on the wall, Diazian did what he had always done. He manipulated the situation to his own advantage. In a stunning move, he decided to cut a deal with the prosecution. He agreed to plead guilty to the murder of his wife in exchange for taking the death penalty off the table. But there was a condition. He would also have to testify against his former lover and co-conspirator, Linda Henning, should she win an appeal and get a new trial. In January 2002, before Henning's trial even concluded, Diazian Hossenkopf walked into a courtroom, pleaded guilty, and received a sentence of life in prison plus 60 years. As part of his plea deal, he gave a detailed, chilling confession to the police. Sitting in a sterile interrogation room, the man who had built his life on lies finally, and calmly, told the truth. With a disturbing lack of emotion, he described how he had meticulously planned Gurley's murder for months. He recounted the abduction, the terror in his wife's eyes, and the final, brutal act. He admitted to using the sword found on the West Mesa to end her life. His confession was a masterclass in narcissistic detachment, the final performance of a man who saw other people not as human beings, but as obstacles or tools. His betrayal of Linda Henning was absolute. The man she had loved, the man for whom she had thrown away her life, had turned on her to save himself. But there was one secret that Diazian Hossenkopf refused to give up. He confessed to the murder, but he would not tell them where he had buried Gurley's body. That was his last piece of power, his final act of control over the woman he had erased, and the family he had shattered. He had been brought to justice, but he ensured that there would be no final peace for Gurley Chu. The conviction of Diazian Hossenkopf and Linda Henning brought the legal chapter of the case to a close, but it did not end the story. The central, haunting question remained, and remains to this day. Where is Gurley? Diazian Hossenkopf, the only person who knows for certain where he left his wife's remains, has kept his silence. Over the years, he has occasionally hinted that he might reveal the location, using it as a bargaining chip or a tool for further psychological games, but he has never followed through. For Gurley's family in Malaysia, this has meant an agony without end. There is no grave to visit, no final resting place, no sense of closure. Her spirit, like her body, is lost to the vast, silent desert. The legacy of the Gurley Chu Hossenkopf case is a complex and disturbing one. It stands as a chilling testament to the destructive power of domestic abuse and the terrifying potential of narcissistic personality disorders. Diazian Hossenkopf was more than just a liar or a killer. He was a black hole of charisma, a man who could bend reality around himself and pull others into his orbit of delusion and violence. The story is a cautionary tale about the dangers of believing in something, or someone, too completely, and the terrifying ease with which a person can be convinced to abandon their own morality for the sake of a charismatic leader. It also serves as a strange and dark footnote in the history of conspiracy theories. While the reptilian alien theory was a fringe belief, Diazian used it as the ideological fuel for a very real-world horror. He took a bizarre fantasy and weaponized it, turning it into a justification for murder. It's a stark reminder that even the most outlandish ideas can have deadly consequences when they are embraced by a disturbed and determined mind. Linda Henning remains in prison, still maintaining that she was a victim of brainwashing. She has exhausted her appeals. Diazian Hossenkopf is also serving his life sentence, a con man whose final con was to trade his testimony for his life, leaving a trail of broken lives and unanswered questions in his wake. Bill Miller, the man who helped them and then testified against them, served a reduced sentence for his cooperation and has since faded from public view. Unlike the West Memphis 3 case, which was a story of a community's collective delusion, the murder of Gurley Chu was the product of a singular, focused madness. It wasn't a town that was convinced of a lie. It was one woman, convinced by one man, but the outcome was the same. A tragic and senseless loss of life, and a justice that feels forever incomplete. The New Mexico sun still beats down on the West Mesa. Hikers and explorers still wander its remote trails. And somewhere out there, beneath the sand and the scrub brush, lies the final secret of a man who thought he was a god, and the woman he sacrificed to his own monstrous ego. The case is closed, the killers are behind bars, but as long as Girlie Chu remains unfound, the desert will continue to whisper her name. For our final story tonight, we journey to the manicured lawns and quiet, tree-lined streets of the American suburb. This is a different kind of darkness. It's not born of panic or delusion, but of something far more common, and perhaps more terrifying, failure. We travel back to 1971, to a stately home in Westfield, New Jersey, a place of supposed affluence and order. This is a story about a man who built his life like a house of cards, and when the slightest breeze threatened to knock it down, he chose to burn the whole world with it. This is the story of the man who almost got away with the perfect crime, and the terrifying logic of a patriarch's pride. In the affluent suburban town of Westfield, New Jersey, the house at 431 Hillside Avenue was a landmark. It was a sprawling, 19-room Victorian mansion named Breeze Knoll, a relic of a grander era, complete with a Tiffany stained glass skylight in its ballroom. For the neighbors, the family who lived there, the Lists, seemed to fit the setting perfectly. They were the picture of quiet, respectable, upper-middle-class life. There was John, the father, a serious and devout Lutheran accountant. There was Helen, his wife, and their 3 teenage children, Patricia, John Jr., and Frederick. And there was John's elderly mother, Alma. They were churchgoers, a family that kept to themselves, projecting an image of stoic, slightly old-fashioned propriety. But by November of 1971, the neighbors started to notice that something was wrong. The lights at Breeze Knoll, usually managed with frugal precision by the stern John List, were now burning day and night. The mail was piling up. The milk delivery was left untouched. And from within the dark, silent house, a strange, continuous sound could be heard. Organ music, piped through the home's intercom system. For weeks, this eerie tableau continued. Finally, on December 7, 1971, nearly a month after the last time anyone had seen the family, the police were called. What they found inside was a scene of unimaginable, yet meticulously ordered, horror. The house was cold, the thermostat turned down low. In the grand ballroom, laid out on sleeping bags as if they were camping, were the bodies of John's wife, Helen, and their 3 children. Upstairs, in her attic apartment, lay the body of his mother, Alma. All 5 had been shot. The scene was eerily calm, devoid of any signs of a struggle. It was not a robbery gone wrong or a chaotic crime of passion. It was a methodical execution. And of the patriarch, John Emil List, there was no sign. He had vanished. But he had left behind a clue, a 5-page letter addressed to his pastor, laid out on the desk in his study. The letter was a confession, a chilling explanation of his actions, and a window into a mind that had chosen annihilation over shame. The search for a missing family man was over before it began. A new, far longer search was about to commence. The hunt for a ghost who had meticulously erased his entire world. To understand how a man could methodically murder his entire family, one must first understand the man himself. John Emil List was a product of his time and his upbringing. Born in 1925, he was a man forged in the crucible of the Great Depression and World War II. He was raised with a strict German Lutheran faith that emphasized order, discipline, and the absolute authority of the patriarch. To John List, life was a series of rules to be followed, and success was not just a goal, but a moral obligation. Failure was not an option. It was a sin. He was, by all accounts, a man of profound rigidity. He controlled his family's lives with an iron fist, dictating everything from their church attendance to their social activities. He was an accountant, a profession that suited his meticulous and detail-oriented personality. He saw the world in black and white, a ledger of debits and credits, of right and wrong. The image of a successful, devout, An orderly family was the most important asset he possessed. But by 1971, that asset was in catastrophic decline. The perfect facade he had so carefully constructed was crumbling from the inside out. The primary stressor was financial. John List, the successful provider, had lost his job as a vice president at a bank months earlier. Too proud to tell his family, he maintained the fiction of his daily routine, leaving the house every morning in his suit and tie, only to spend the day reading newspapers at the train station. He was drowning in debt. The mortgage on the Grand Victorian mansion was crippling, and he had secretly been siphoning money from his elderly mother's savings account just to keep them afloat. The shame of his failure was a cancer eating him alive. The problems were not just financial. His wife, Helen, was also a source of deep-seated anxiety for him. Years earlier, she had contracted syphilis from her first husband, a fact that List, with his rigid sense of purity and propriety, found deeply shameful. Though the disease had been treated, it had contributed to her declining health. By 1971, she was suffering from alcoholism and had become increasingly withdrawn and dependent on tranquilizers. The perfect wife was no longer perfect. His children, too, were beginning to stray from his control. The 1960s had come and gone, and the cultural landscape was changing in ways that terrified and disgusted John List. His eldest daughter, 16-year-old Patricia, was interested in becoming an actress, a profession he viewed as decadent and sinful. His sons, John Jr. and Frederick, were growing into young men with their own interests, moving away from his sphere of absolute influence. The orderly world he had built was threatened not just by poverty, but by chaos, by the very nature of life itself. Faced with this cascade of failures, financial, marital, and patriarchal, John List arrived at a horrifyingly logical conclusion. In his confession letter, he explained his rationale with chilling clarity. He believed that poverty and the sinful influence of the world would corrupt his family and lead their souls to damnation. He couldn't bear the thought of them learning of his failure and living in disgrace. So, in his twisted mind, the most merciful, most loving thing he could do was to kill them. He would save them by sending their souls to heaven before they could be tainted by the shame of his failure. It was the ultimate act of patriarchal control, a decision to erase his family rather than face his own inadequacies. On November 9, 1971, he put his plan into action. With a cold, accountant's precision, he began to systematically dismantle his world. He waited until his children left for school. He took his own 9mm Steer pistol and his father's old .22 caliber revolver. He shot his wife, Helen, in the back of the head as she drank her morning coffee. Then he went up to the third floor and shot his 84-year-old mother, Alma, as she ate her breakfast. He then dragged their bodies into the ballroom, placing them on sleeping bags. He ate lunch, and then he waited. As his children came home from school, one by one, he met them at the door and shot them. Patricia, 16, and Frederick, 13, were first. He left their bodies in the ballroom with their mother. Finally, John Jr., 15, arrived home from a soccer game. List shot him multiple times in the chest and face, as the boy reportedly tried to fight back. After the slaughter was complete, List's methodical nature took over. He wrote the letters to the school, the post office, and his and Helen's employers, explaining that the family was going away for several weeks to care for a sick relative. He cancelled the milk, newspaper, and mail deliveries. He cleaned the guns and returned them to their cases. He turned the thermostat down to save money. And then, in a final, bizarre act, he turned on the house-wide intercom system and tuned it to a religious radio station, filling the cold, silent mansion with the sound of organ music. He ate a meal, slept in his own bed one last time, and then, the next morning, he walked out the door and vanished. For nearly 18 years, John Emil List ceased to exist. For 18 years, the case of the Westfield family annihilator went cold. John List became a local legend, a suburban boogeyman, the subject of whispered rumors and cautionary tales. The grand house on Hillside Avenue, the site of the murders, stood as a silent, decaying monument to the crime. In a strange and poetic turn of events, It was destroyed by a fire of suspicious origin in 1972, a year after the murders, wiping away the physical heart of the tragedy. The investigation, led by a dedicated Westfield police chief named James Moran, never officially closed, but the leads dried up. List had planned his disappearance with the same meticulous care as the murders. He had a nearly 2-decade head start. Investigators followed up on hundreds of tips from all over the country and even overseas, but none of them panned out. The trail was ice cold. John List had seemingly performed the perfect disappearing act. He had become a ghost. But in 1989, the case was given a new life by a new form of media, the television show America's Most Wanted. The show, which profiled wanted fugitives and asked the public for help, was a national sensation. The producers decided to feature the 18-year-old case of John List. To do so, they needed more than just old photographs. They needed to show what this man might look like now, as a man in his 60s. They turned to a forensic sculptor named Frank Bender. Bender was an artist, but he was also a keen psychological profiler. He studied List's old photos, read about his personality, his rigidity, his pride, his desire for order, and made a series of brilliant deductions. Bender reasoned that a man like List would not fundamentally change. He would still be a man of routine and control. Bender predicted he would likely wear the same style of thick-rimmed glasses to project an air of intelligence and to hide his identity. He sculpted a bust that showed not just how List might have aged, but captured the essence of his cold, controlled personality. It was a bust of a man who looked like he could be your quiet, unassuming neighbor. On May 21, 1989, the segment on John List aired on America's Most Wanted. It was seen by millions of people across the country. The bust created by Frank Bender, a hauntingly lifelike image of a much older John List, was shown to the nation. The show's phone lines lit up. One of those calls came from a woman in a suburb of Denver, Colorado. She had been watching the show, and she was stunned. The story of the murdered family, the details of the crime, and most of all, the face on the sculpture. It was all terrifyingly familiar. She told the operator that the man in the sculpture looked exactly like her former neighbor, a quiet, church-going accountant who called himself Robert Bob Clark. The tip was a bombshell. FBI agents were dispatched to Richmond, Virginia, where Bob Clark had recently moved with his new wife. They found him living a life that was a chilling echo of his past. He was an accountant, a regular churchgoer, and had remarried. He was, once again, the model of quiet suburban respectability. On June 1, 1989, FBI agents arrested him. At first, he steadfastly denied being John List, insisting his name was Bob Clark. But his fingerprints were a perfect match. The ghost had been caught. John List was extradited to New Jersey to stand trial for the murder of his family. His defense argued that he had been suffering from extreme psychological distress due to the financial pressure, claiming a form of diminished capacity. But the prosecution painted a picture of a cold, methodical, and narcissistic killer who had chosen murder as a rational solution to his problems. His own confession letter was the most powerful piece of evidence against him. In April 1990, a jury found him guilty of 5 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 5 consecutive life terms in prison. John List died in prison in 2008 at the age of 82, unrepentant to the end. In interviews, he continued to express his belief that he had done the right thing, that he had saved his family's souls. The story of John List is the ultimate perversion of the American dream and the terrifying endpoint of patriarchal pride. It is a story not about a monster who looked different from the rest of us, but about a monster who looked exactly like us. It's a chilling reminder that the most profound darkness can hide behind the most ordinary of faces, in the quietest houses, on the most respectable streets. The evil at Breeze Knoll wasn't an invading force. It was a rot that grew from within, a product of a man who so feared the shame of being seen as a failure, he was willing to erase everyone he claimed to love, just to save himself.